I remember that night like it was a carefully rehearsed scene, the kind you think only exists in movies until it happens to you. The smell of roasted chicken and my mother's overcooked mashed potatoes filled the air, laughter bouncing lightly off the walls. Everything seemed normal, maybe even comforting, until my father cleared his throat in that unmistakably serious tone that made my stomach drop. "You have to give up your room or get out of this house," he said, like it was a casual request, not the ultimatum that would upend my world. My fork paused halfway to my mouth, the taste of gravy suddenly bitter on my tongue. My mother nodded sharply, her eyes cold and unyielding, while my siblings exchanged smirks that made me feel smaller than I had ever felt. Shock rooted me to the chair. Betrayal surged before comprehension could even catch up. I thought of my room, my sanctuary, my memories, every late-night laugh and quiet reflection. How could they strip that away as if it meant nothing? I wanted to speak, to argue, to cry, but only a hollow silence escaped me, leaving my disbelief as loud as their declarations. As I sat there, stunned by their ultimatum, my mind couldn't help but wander back to the nights I spent in that room. The walls had seen everything. My victories, my heartbreaks, my secret dreams scribbled in journals no one was allowed to read. I remembered lying on the worn carpet as a child, building forts from blankets, and imagining myself a queen in a world that only existed in my head. The room had cradled my laughter and caught my tears. It had been my fortress, my place of comfort when the rest of the house felt cold or indifferent. And now, in that same dining room, their words turned that sanctuary into a target, a symbol of control and cruelty. I could feel the unfairness clawing at me, the way they favored my siblings, rewarding them while I was expected to sacrifice everything silently. The thought of leaving my room, and everything it represented, was unbearable. FOMO tightened its grip. They didn't see the value of my memories, my history, or even me. The stark contrast between the warmth of my past and the harshness of this moment was suffocating. And I realized just how deeply their neglect and favoritism had hurt me. I took a deep breath, hoping logic might pierce the wall of arrogance surrounding my parents. "This room isn't just a space," I said, my voice trembling but determined. "It's my home, my memories. I've worked for this, just like everyone else." My father smirked, dismissing me with a wave of his hand, as if my words were nothing more than background noise. "You think you deserve special treatment?" He scoffed. My mother chimed in, casting a pointed glance at my younger sibling, the golden child in their eyes, who had already been promised the house, the inheritance, and the spotlight. I felt my face flush, anger mixing with humiliation. How could they favor them so blatantly while reducing me to a problem to be managed? Every word I tried to speak was twisted or ignored. Every plea met with mockery. My chest tightened, the room shrinking around me, suffocating with the weight of their indifference. I realized then that reasoning with them was pointless. They weren't seeing me as their child, just an obstacle standing between them and their version of fairness. The injustice burned, leaving me simultaneously small and furious, and I knew that the only way out of this wasn't through negotiation. It would have to be through strategy, patience, and eventually, revenge. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, and the house finally stopped humming with their voices, I sat on the edge of my bed and let the silence do the thinking for me. I knew anger felt good in the moment, but it burned out fast and left me exhausted. What I needed was a plan. Small, quiet moves that would protect what was mine without feeding the drama they craved. I started by inventorying everything that mattered in that room. The faded poster from graduation, the box of letters from college, the lamp my grandmother had given me, the receipts tucked into a drawer proving I'd paid for repairs myself. Those things were more than objects. They were proof I had existed independently in this house. I wrote down possibilities on a scrap of paper. Lock the door to certain boxes, back up important files to the cloud, email copies of receipts proving I paid for repairs, quietly move sentimental items to a trusted friend's apartment. Nothing dramatic. No confrontations, no flying plates, just quiet logistics that would create friction if they tried to take the room. I also thought about allies. The cousin who once offered me legal forms, the retired teacher who kept meticulous records, the neighbor who noticed when I stayed late fixing the leak. Each small contact felt like a stitch reinforcing my fraying safety net, Every plan felt like a tiny act of reclamation. I rehearsed what I would say if questioned, phrasing sentences to sound calm and reasonable while hiding the tremor underneath. The moral dilemma gnawed at me. Was it petty to protect boxes and postcards, or a justified defense of my history? The power imbalance was cruelly obvious. They had titles, louder voices, and the public image. But I began to see that leverage could be subtler. A ledger here, a witness there, a quietly filed note that could complicate their certainty. Before sleep, I tucked the list under my mattress like a secret pact. Foreshadowing felt almost absurd, but necessary. I was planting seeds for a future reversal that would not be loud, but meticulous. I would not be baited into exposing my pain. Instead, I would build small, undeniable truths that would one day tilt the scales. And with that small, stubborn hope, I drifted toward sleep, already charting the first moves of a quiet counterattack. I held on to that quiet resolve. The next day, I found an unexpected lifeline in my cousin, Lila. She had always been quietly observant, never taking sides at the dinner table. But now she slipped me a note while everyone was distracted. "I know what they're doing is wrong. I've got your back." My chest lifted in a way it hadn't in hours. Finally, someone acknowledged the unfairness, someone who didn't laugh at my expense or dismiss my feelings. That afternoon, we met secretly in the garage, away from prying eyes and judgmental glances. She had small suggestions, ways to document ownership of the room, ways to gather proof of the favors given to my siblings, and even ideas for legal loopholes I hadn't considered. Each tip, each whispered plan, felt like a victory, tiny but monumental. For the first time since the ultimatum, I felt less isolated. Their cruelty at dinner had left me reeling. But in these quiet moments, I realized I wasn't completely alone. The contrast between their mockery and Lila's quiet support was sharp, like night and day. Where my parents had tried to shrink me, she helped me expand my thinking, gave me strategies I could act on without their notice. It wasn't about immediate confrontation. It was about preparation, patience, and building strength in secrecy. In that hidden camaraderie, I felt a glimmer of hope, a spark that maybe, just maybe, I could turn the tables without losing my dignity over the next few days. Every encounter with my parents felt like walking through a minefield of superiority and disdain. At breakfast, my father boasted about the new car he had bought for my younger sibling, the gleaming metal and polished leather a silent reminder of what they valued. My mother, not to be outdone, recounted every achievement of my golden sibling, how they had been invited to the best schools, praised publicly, and never reprimanded for a single misstep. When I tried to mention my own accomplishments, my words were met with dismissive laughter or a raised eyebrow, as if my efforts were invisible, unworthy of recognition. Each slight stung more than the last, chipping away at the patience I was clinging to. I felt a familiar knot of anger and humiliation tighten in my chest, a mix of betrayal and disbelief. How could they so blatantly favor one child while reducing me to a footnote in my own life story? The injustice was suffocating, yet beneath the hurt, a quiet determination began to grow. I started noticing patterns, small cracks in their arrogance, moments when their overconfidence could be turned against them. Every boast, every public display of status became a breadcrumb leading to the twist I would unveil later, an invisible leverage they didn't even realize I was gathering. The audience should feel my outrage, yes, but also the simmering anticipation, the kind that promises eventual justice and reversal. I clenched my fists under the table, pretending to sip my coffee, while in my mind, a plan began taking shape, quietly and meticulously, ready to shift the balance when the time was right. The day I decided to speak up, I felt like I was stepping into cold water, bracing, alert, and oddly calm. I waited until the family was gathered, the same dining table where they'd delivered that brutal ultimatum, and let the silence settle before I spoke. "There's something you all need to know about the house," I said, keeping my voice steady. They turned toward me like I'd announced a scandal. My father's smirk was ready. He loved being the one with answers. "What now?" he asked, irritation thinly veiled. In the quiet weeks after the dinner, while I'd been cataloging receipts and conversations, I stumbled across a detail in my grandmother's will that changed everything. Buried in legalese was an occupancy clause awarding priority to the child who had been the primary resident of a particular room for 5 consecutive years. It sounded tedious on paper, but the reality was different. I had lived in that room longer than anyone, through illnesses, late-night study sessions, and the small repairs I'd paid for when no one else bothered. It wasn't glamorous, but it was documented. I explained it plainly, showing copies of receipts, old utility statements, and a dated letter from my grandmother referencing my long residency. For a moment, the room's hum turned into a strained silence. My mother's napkin trembled in her hands. My father waved it off at first, calling it a technicality and questioning my interpretation. "You're reading things too literally," he said, attempting a laugh. Their immediate dismissal only confirmed they were used to being unchallenged. They underestimated how methodical I'd become. I had expected mockery. Instead, I let their scoffs hang in the air. I watched expressions shift as the weight of documentation settled between us. The more they tried to minimize what I presented, the clearer it became that their dismissal was reflex, not reasoned counter-argument. That was my opening. It wasn't a dramatic victory, no shouting match, no courtroom triumph, just a subtle recalibration. I left the evidence visibly placed on the table before excusing myself, noticing how their chatter faltered. For the first time since they'd told me to give up the room, I sensed their certainty wobble. It was the smallest of reversals, but it felt seismic, proof that leverage didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, and that whisper could start a louder change. I smiled inwardly, feeling hope like a private flame, promising I wouldn't stop. After planting the seed of doubt with the lease and inheritance documents, I knew I had to act carefully, quietly. I began by organizing my affairs in ways that would leave a trail they couldn't ignore. I updated files, labeled boxes, and made small, deliberate changes around the house, moving sentimental items to places where only I could access them, keeping receipts and proof of my contributions neatly documented. Every action was calculated, a subtle assertion that I was not powerless. I even started scheduling small errands and meetings outside the house, casually dropping hints about my independence, meeting with an attorney, consulting with a family friend about property matters, and quietly handling repairs myself instead of asking for their approval. These gestures were almost invisible on the surface, yet every little act made my presence more significant, a quiet defiance growing under the radar. I could see it in their distracted glances, the subtle tightening of my father's jaw, my mother's forced smiles when I mentioned a meeting or a task I had handled alone. Suspense began to build, though no one yet realized why. My moves weren't confrontational. They were strategic. Each small victory planted a seed, laying the groundwork for the ultimate twist I had been planning for weeks. It was empowering in a way I hadn't anticipated. While outwardly I appeared composed, inwardly I relished the knowledge that control was shifting, ever so slightly toward me. Their arrogance and dismissal would eventually meet a quiet but undeniable reckoning, and with each deliberate step, I felt the tension swell, preparing for a confrontation that would feel inevitable, yet shocking. The night they chose to humiliate me was the night they invited extended family over, under the pretense of a celebration. I should have seen it coming, but I wanted to believe in normalcy, in the illusion that things could still be ordinary. They arranged the living room with extra chairs and polished silverware. Midway through the gathering, when laughter lulled, my father leaned forward with a theatrical sigh and announced the ultimatum in front of everyone, his voice dripping with a smug finality I would never forget. I felt each word like cold glass against my skin, and yet something inside me tightened, not in fear but in purpose. I could have erupted, called them liars, accused them of cruelty, but I held my composure. I let my silence speak, steady breathing, a slow, polite smile, the calm of someone who refuses to be baited. My cheeks burned with shame and humiliation, but I refused to hand them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. I noticed my cousin Lila's eyes on me, offering a tiny, secret encouragement that steadied my hands. As the guests shifted awkwardly, whispers fluttered around the room like nervous birds. My parents basked in the control, enjoying the social theater of their power, savoring every sideways glance that confirmed their dominance. They believed the spectacle had succeeded, that I had been publicly diminished. But the humiliation planted a different seed in me. Not a rush for immediate revenge, but a patient, fierce resolve. I listened as relatives took sides, some murmuring sympathy, others sticking to the comfortable script that favored the loudest voices. Each whispered opinion, each tilted head, became data I stored away, pieces of social proof that might later tilt a crowd or sway a neighbor. When the evening finally wound down, I excused myself with a politeness that felt heavy, carrying the sting of their words like a small, sharp stone in my pocket. I walked back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the echo of the walls press in. I allowed the humiliation its moment, let anger warm into a steady heat, then turned that heat into a plan. The public shaming had not broken me. It had clarified my aim, making my next moves cleaner and more certain than before. I would not be undone by them. When I finally pulled the thread tight, it wasn't with theatrics, but with paperwork and witnesses. I had spent weeks quietly converting small advantages into something concrete, a transfer of billing, a registered notice filed with the municipal records, and a notarized statement from the neighbor who had watched me live in that room for years. The twist wasn't a secret fortune. It was the kind of power families ignore when they confuse volume with authority. The day I presented it, I did not shout. I walked into the living room where they had staged my humiliation with a calm that felt like defiance. I laid out the municipal notice, the dated receipts, and the neighbor's affidavit with hands that didn't tremble. My father glanced, then laughed, the reflex of a man who believed he could laugh misfortune away. My mother read, her smile freezing into something close to panic. "What is this?" my father demanded, the first crack of disbelief. He asked to see the originals, and I obliged, watching as color drained from his face while mine steadied. Their arrogance had been a house of cards built on assumptions, that I would be too meek to act, too ashamed to prove myself. They hadn't counted on me documenting the ordinary evidence of my life here. Word spread. A cousin called to verify a detail. An aunt sent a question. The gathered guests from the previous humiliation now muttered among themselves, eyes flicking between the paperwork and the parents who had orchestrated the drama. The social tide shifted with the slow, inevitable grace of water finding a new channel. My parents tried to argue technicalities, to paint me as petty, but each attempt only sharpened the document's clarity. When their faces finally sagged with comprehension, there was no dramatic collapse, only the stunned silence of people who realized they rushed to punish the wrong person. I felt a thin ribbon of pity tangled with triumph. The reversal was complete. The room remained mine, secured not by noise but by the quiet labor of proof. They had been beaten at their own game, not through spectacle, but through the stubborn accumulation of truth. I walked back to my room aware that nothing would ever be the same. Their certainty had fractured, and mine had hardened into resolve. The ripple effect was immediate. Family friends who had attended the previous dinner began asking questions, murmuring about the documents I had quietly presented. The guests who once nodded politely at my parents' authority now looked between us, sensing a shift they hadn't expected. My father's usual smug confidence faltered. My mother's sharp, rehearsed remarks stumbled into silence. Every slight smirk or dismissive comment they had thrown at me earlier returned to them like a shadow, exposing their arrogance and cruelty to anyone watching. The social weight they had carried for decades crumbled subtly, but undeniably. I stood calmly, letting the moment unfold without interference. I didn't gloat, I didn't need to. My composure spoke louder than any words could, a stark contrast to their flustered attempts to reclaim control. I met their eyes with steady resolve, the kind that quietly said I had survived their cruelty and emerged intact. The humiliation they had tried to heap on me was now mirrored back, but this time with dignity as my armor. A quiet satisfaction settled over me as the reality sank in. They had underestimated me, misjudged my patience, and dismissed my quiet efforts. The audience should feel it too. The catharsis of justice delivered without theatrics, the deep pleasure of seeing arrogance confronted with calm competence. The moment was a culmination of planning, patience, and silent rebellion. A reminder that power isn't always about volume or dominance. Sometimes it's about strategy, quiet persistence, and timing. I allowed myself a small private smile, knowing the scales had finally tipped, and I could move forward with my dignity intact, while they grappled with the consequences of their own hubris. Sitting alone in my room that evening, I let the day's events wash over me. The anger, the humiliation, the careful planning, It all felt like a lifetime compressed into a single arc of experience. I thought about how much I had lost in the process. Trust in my parents, innocence, the belief that family always meant protection. But I also recognized the strength I had gained. The patience to endure their cruelty without snapping, the strategy to turn their arrogance against them, and the clarity to act quietly and deliberately when it mattered most. For the first time in years, I felt truly empowered, not through confrontation, but through thoughtful action and steadfast resolve. My dignity remained intact, bolstered by the knowledge that I had not stooped to their level, yet I had claimed justice. Every memory of dismissal, every sneer and mocking remark, now served as a reminder of how carefully I had navigated the imbalance of power. In this quiet reflection, I realized the journey had been as much about growth as it had been about revenge. I had learned to trust my instincts, honor my own needs, and recognize the subtle levers of control that could shift even the most entrenched family dynamics. It wasn't about punishment alone. It was about reclaiming myself, my space, and my voice. The sense of closure was profound, bittersweet, and deeply satisfying, marking the end of a chapter defined by both struggle and triumph. Even after the dust settled, the house never felt the same. My parents moved with quieter caution, their smiles tighter, their words measured. The siblings who had once been unchallenged in their privileges now glanced at me differently, a mixture of respect, fear, and begrudging acknowledgement in their eyes. The family dynamics had shifted, subtle but irreversible. Alliances formed and dissolved, old patterns disrupted, and fractured relationships stretched like delicate threads across the household. I had won, not through anger or spectacle, but through patience, planning, and unyielding resolve. Yet the victory wasn't entirely sweet. I missed the warmth that had once existed, the simplicity of trust and shared laughter before favoritism and arrogance took hold. There was a hollowness in the triumph, a recognition that justice sometimes comes at a quiet cost. I could celebrate, but the echoes of betrayal remained, lingering in corners of memory and unspoken tensions at the table. As I reflected on everything, I realized the power of moral equilibrium. Karma isn't always loud, but it has a way of finding those who underestimate patience, dignity, and quiet intelligence. The lesson was clear, both to me and implicitly, to those who had watched or listened. Cruelty and arrogance have consequences, and the most effective victories are often those won without raising your voice. I hoped that anyone witnessing this story, whether through my eyes or their own experiences, would recognize the weight of fairness, the satisfaction of justice, and the quiet thrill of seeing balance restored, even when the path is painstaking and subtle. Just as I thought the dust had settled, I caught myself wondering what the next gathering would bring. Families are unpredictable, and old habits die hard. Would my parents try another power play, testing boundaries they once thought unassailable? Or would my siblings attempt to reclaim the spotlight, oblivious to the subtle ways I had changed the game? The uncertainty was thrilling, a quiet tension that refused to let the story end neatly. I smiled to myself, knowing that the room, and everything it represented, was finally mine, yet aware that family dynamics have a way of looping back in unexpected ways. As I set down my cup of tea, I realized that victory isn't a single moment but an ongoing process, a careful balance of strategy, patience, and observation. Each choice, each decision, ripples outward, shaping future interactions and quietly teaching lessons that words alone cannot. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of what had been accomplished settle around me, while simultaneously feeling the anticipation of what might come next. For anyone who's faced unfairness or betrayal, I hope this story sparks reflection. How far would you go to protect yourself? And what would justice look like in your own life? Because sometimes, the most satisfying twists are the ones you never see coming.